Hello and welcome to Aughton Math. In this edition of Aughton Math, we're going to talk about inverse trig functions. But before we get started, let's review something that we've already learned about trigonometry and angles. So if we have a right triangle and we have an angle measure and we have one identified side length and we have one unidentified side length, we can use the relationships that we know in trigonometry to figure out what the value of the hypotenuse or the unknown side length is. So recall that the relationship for sine is going to be the opposite over the hypotenuse. So I can say sine is equal to opposite side over the hypotenuse. And in this case, if I were to talk about the sine of 55 degrees, it would be, this is a 9, it would be the sine of 55 degrees is equal to 9 over x. Now using algebra, we can determine, and also trigonometry, and our calculators, we can determine what x is. So I rewrite this as x times sine 55 degrees is equal to 9, or x is equal to 9 over sine of 55 degrees. So I can figure out from one angle and one side, I can determine the values in a right triangle of the other angles and the other unknown sides. Now what happens if I provide you with the value of two side lengths, but now you're going to have to figure out what the angle measure is. So in this case, I want to figure out the angle measure for A. So I have an opposite value over an adjacent value. I'm going to have to use tangent. So tangent of angle A is equal to the opposite value, or 10, over the adjacent value, which is 9. But that doesn't tell me what the measure of angle A is. It just tells me what the tangent of angle A is. In order to figure out what angle A is, we use something called an inverse trig function. And in this inverse trig function, we're going to figure out what the measure of angle A is by the relationship that's provided to us. And that inverse trig function looks something like this. Say tan to the negative 1 of 10 over 9 is equal to A. So when I write inverse tangent, I'm just changing the relationships between finding out the angle measure with the side versus finding out the side length from the angle measure. So in the original case that I demonstrated, I found out what the side relationship of the side lengths were and what the side length was based on an angle measure. In this case, I'm finding out what the angle measure is based on the relationships of the sides. So I take a look at my calculator. I see an inverse tangent function. I type in inverse tangent of 10 divided by 9. And you should get an angle measure for A of approximately 48 degrees. Okay, so let's talk specifically about sine, cosine, and tangent functions as they relate to inverse sine, cosine, and tangent functions, because there's still a couple more specific things you need to know. So as I mentioned before, if I have the sine of 90 degrees is equal to 1, then I know that the inverse sine of 1 is equal to 90. So again, I'm taking the sine of an angle is equal to some value or some relationship. Then I know that the inverse sine of that relationship is equal to 90 degrees. So if the sine of angle A is equal to y, then inverse sine of y is equal to A. Now when I talk about the measure of an angle, it's always going to be with respect to sine between negative 90 and 90 degrees, or negative pi halves and pi halves. And why is that the case? Well, the calculator doesn't really know what the angle is that you're referring to other than the reference angle that you're talking about. So the calculator will figure out the value for the reference angle, but it's not going to figure out the value for your particular angle in question. So let's take an example here. If I write in, or if I type in sine of 150 degrees and sine of 30 degrees, I will get the same answer. It's sine of 0.5. Or if I take inverse, so sine of 150 is equal to 0.5, and I know sine of 30 degrees is equal to 0.5 as well. But if I type into my calculator inverse sine of 0.5, I'm going to end up with a value in my calculator that says 30 degrees. All right. So your calculator doesn't know the difference between 150 and 30 when it comes to inverse sine, because it's just giving you the value for the angle based on whatever the reference angle is. So when I say that the range of output for sine is going to be between negative 90 and 90, that's what the range of output would be for your calculator. You then have to go back in, and based on what you're given from the question, you need to figure out whether or not the angle in question is 150 or 30 degrees or some other value. Now, if we talk about the range as being between 90 and negative 90 degrees, this covers the gamut of all the possible answers for angles, because I've got, in this case, above the x-axis, I've got a positive value, and in this case, below the x-axis, I have a negative value. So I have all the reference angles I need from plus 90 to minus 90. Well, it's a little bit different for cosine. For cosine, I still, if I want to find the inverse of a particular relationship, it still works the same way as sine does. So cosine of angle B is equal to x, then inverse cosine of x is equal to angle B. But the output that you're going to get from your calculator in this case is going to be between 0 and 180, because this gives us the full range of possibilities for both positive and negative angles for cosine. So it's going to be between 180 and 0 degrees. Finally, if I think about the tangent of angle C, the tangent of angle C, let's say, is z, then again the inverse tangent of z is equal to angle C. And in this case, we're just dealing with the range between negative 90 and 90, because if you take the tangent of negative 90 or 90, you'll end up with an undefined answer. So that's why there's no equal sign here. So remember, for tangent, we're using this relationship, the same relationship as sine. But in the case where you have a positive 90 degrees, x is 0. So knowing that the tangent is equal to y over x, this becomes an undefined value. So tangent of 90 degrees or negative 90 degrees, both undefined. So just as a review then, in the prior lessons we talked about trying to find what the value is for a relationship between two sides based on an angle on a side. In this case, we're finding out what the angle measure is based on the relationships that we already have for two sides. And for that case, you're going to use the inverse trig function. For sine and for tangent, you're going to get a value between negative 90 and 90. For cosine, you're going to get a value between 0 and 180. And those are the reference angles that you're going to need to use in order to apply your knowledge to the problem to figure out the problem.